Welcome beauties, welcome cuties. Today is Monday, according to some the worst day of the week. And today what we have for us is a rerun of what we checked already several months ago at the start of Sepulcher, which is the player versus bots video. It took us a little bit longer into this patch to check this out because, as we might have noticed right as we approached the beginning of this expansion, finding out simulations, finding out how your specs were supposed to perform according to sims was very, very difficult because apparently developing functioning AIs with the new talent system was very, very difficult, and it took quite a long time to get some proper working simulations according to the many options and the many talent builds Spec can have. However, now we are almost 3 months into the expansion and it's gotten much easier, much more manageable to get some simulations out for all of the specs. So I wanted to check once again to make a comparison just to see how close to reality, how reliable sims are at the moment, to see the supposed performance of specs if controlled by an AI executing a perfect rotation compared to how humans actually play the spec, as well as a few other interesting things that is always cool to check out, like for example how many buttons each of the specs are pressing, which are the more button intensive and which are the more chill when it comes to spamming buttons, as well as which other specs that are more RNG and more punishing if you mess out some parts of the rotation. So looking at the classic standard single target simulations and the rankings of what all of the specs were supposed to be doing according to simulations. The top 10 is as follows. It sees Frost Mage right at the top by also some significant margin. Following Frost Mage is Survival, and then Beast Mastery, Unholy, Fire, Enhancement, Destruction, Devastation, Arms, and Assassination. That is supposed to be the top 10. The Gamba build in Enhancement stands for the No Lavalash Ascendance RNG build, basically. Once we cross-reference this to reality, to how players have actually been doing in boss damage, just by looking at Warcraft logs, we see that 7 out of 10 of these predicted top rankings are correct. A little bit different here and there in the actual rankings, but in the top 10 we see 7 of them. The ones who make top 10 in reality compared to the simulations are Affliction Warlock, Frost, DK, and Arcane Mage. However, once we go back to look at the actual sims, we can see that Affliction Warlock, Frost, DK, and Arcane Mage are right below the cutoff of top 10 that we just checked. And even then, it's just some 200 to 300 DPS maybe worth of difference. So they are still very, very high up regardless. So in this sim, 7 out of 10 are respecting the predictions of the AI in terms of performance. What about the bottom? What about the worst performers according to the AI when it comes to single target damage? Well, the worst performers are right here. We have Windwalker, Balance, we have Retribution, we have Outlaw, we have Demonology, Fury Warrior, Feral, Subtlety, Havoc, and Marksmanship. In here, the correct percentage of the sim goes to 9 out of 10, because the only one in reality who actually isn't in this bottom 10 is Subtlety, which is replaced by Elemental in reality. But the remaining 9 specs are the 9 specs that currently in real results from Warcraft logs are towards the bottom of single target boss damage. So the sims are giving us a somewhat relatively correct understanding of how specs are supposed to be performing in single target at the very least. We don't have that much of a clear guess when it comes to predicting AoE damage of specs. Now, the interesting parts about simulations though don't end here, because what we also can look at is the APM, the actions per minute, how many buttons you're going to be pressing as a spec when you are in an encounter. Now, you might not notice this, you might not know about this if you don't play one, but of course, the top 3 when it comes to spamming buttons is of course dominated by tanks. That is because tanks have quite a few abilities that can be pressed off the global cooldown. So they don't have to wait for the global cooldown to end to press a different ability. That's why a spec like Guardian Druid presses 81 buttons in 60 seconds. So more than 1 per second, because, for example, the Iron Fur that they can spam is not on the global cooldown. Protection Paladin presses 75 and Protection Warrior presses 74. That is a lot of buttons to be pressing constantly, which is also why it's somewhat funny when you hear DPS complaining about the stress they have in playing Fury Warrior or in playing Outlaw Rogue, and that they will be getting carpal tunnel if you play too much of that spec. Well, try playing a tank. That's 15 to 20% more hectic than playing those two specs, which are still, truth to be told, on the highest end when it comes to playing a DPS, because Havoc Demon Hunter is 73, APM Outlaw is 72, and Fury Warrior is 69. So they are the three most busy DPS specs when it comes to pressing buttons. Also, shouldn't surprise you that the majority of the specs towards the top are going to be melee DPS. Why, you ask? Well, because melee DPS don't have to cast. So, while other specs might have to cast for 1.5 seconds or for 2 seconds at a time, the melee DPS are just spamming instant abilities, which makes them, in the end, press more buttons. So, more or less, the majority of the melee DPS are going to make up the top half of the list, and then the range DPS, the casters, are going to make up the bottom of the list. The only extras, the only outliers for the range DPS are Balance Druid and Frost Mage. Balance Druid, of course, has its dots being instant, it has a Star Surge being instant, and Wrath spam, which is also very, very fast. So they can still end up casting quite a lot of spells. And then Frost Mage, of course, Ice Lance spam is quite fast since it's instant. The only exception to spamming a lot of buttons is Blood Death Knight, which is a tank, but it's a tank at a much lower rate of spamming button than the rest, because it's only at 60. That is 30 to 40% less than your average tank. That's because most of the buttons are going to be on a cooldown, whether it is Death's Caress, whether it is Blood Boil, whether it is Heart Strike, or even Marrow Rend, or even Death and Decay. They either have a cooldown of its own, or they have a cooldown because they have to wait for runes to regenerate. So you end up pressing far less buttons than the other tanks. Of course, when we look at the reverse, when we look at the bottom, the slowest specs, we have Devastation, we have Destruction, we have Marksmanship, Affliction, Arcane, Demonology, basically a whole bunch of casters. So this time the outliers are going to be the melee specs that are somewhat slow. In this bottom side for slowness, we have the melee outliers being Frost, Death Knight, Windwalker Monk, and the ever-present Assassination Rogue. Devastation has basically taken the spot of the bottom APM spec from Feral. Previously, it was Feral who used to be quite the slow spec in previous expansions. Now Devastation easily takes the spot away. At the very least, what we can see from this is that if Blizzard improved something, is that quite a few of the specs that used to be slow, at the very least have been fastened somewhat. Even if we look at the raid downtime, i.e. how much time in a fight are you going to spend not pressing anything? The list has definitely been improved. In previous expansions, in the worst cases, like Warriors of Draenor or Legion, we used to see Assassination Rogues even in the 30 to 40% of downtime together with Feral Druid. Frost DK was also somewhere in the 20 to 30% of downtime of not pressing anything. Now, all of them are comfortably below the 10% downtime. So at the very least, there has been a decent enough improvement on that regard when it comes to at least still pressing something as a spec. We can finish then with the DPS variance percentage. This basically means how much is your spec going to differ in the result of your damage. This is basically the AI simulating your build 1,000 times, 100,000 times, and finding out how much of a difference there can be between your sims based on the randomness of your rotation, how many things can go right or, super wrong in your rotation. For example, to give you a simple idea in mind, back in the day when Outlaw was playing a lot of the value of Outlaw was around Roll the Bones. Roll the Bones would have made Outlaw a very wildly varying spec in terms of results, because it all depended on which type of dice and how many dice you were going to get when you rolled. Now, Roll the Bones has been, reined in the amount of RNG that can affect Outlaw, so it's now pretty much average. We can see that the RNG-ness kings by a large margin at the moment are Enhancement Shamans and Elemental Shaman. The result of this obviously is because both of them in their best performing spec in single target make use of Ascendance and the RNG-ness attached to Ascendance. You can see that the other enhancement build is not using Ascendance and has basically half the RNG-ness of the Ascendance build for Enhancement Shaman. There are a few other specs quite on the high side in terms of difference of performance, like Unholy Marksmanship or Devastation Evoker, based on many times on things like procs and random things that can occur in your rotation, and then specs way towards the bottom like Shadow Priest, like Subtlety Rogue, Windwalker Monk, and then at the absolute very bottom you have Fury Warrior, which basically plays a circle of a dance, pressing the same 3 to 4 buttons over and over with very little variance. So it's very unlikely for something in the Fury rotation to go terribly wrong or super right and massively change your damage output. It's very straightforward, very continuous, so it's much more stable in that regard. And with this, we are being done with all of the stats we can gain from simulations, and I thought this was going to be a pretty interesting infomercial about the cool things you can grasp from an AI executing a rotation for you. Besides just looking at the rankings, you might also get some knowledge and some interest out of knowing which of the specs press more buttons, for example, because that is also something that might either push you towards or push you away a certain spec. Maybe you are actively looking for a spec that presses more buttons because you have been playing Arcane Mage for a while, you have been playing maybe Destruction Warlock for a while, and you're kind of interested in how would it feel if I played a spec which ends up pressing 50% more buttons than I am currently pressing. Maybe the opposite, maybe you're getting kind of tired of spamming buttons on Havoc Demon Hunter. What about I start playing Devastation Evoker, where I literally press 100% less buttons? Or maybe something like I want to play a spec that is much more straightforward, much less RNG based. I don't want to have wild difference in my results when I play, so I kind of want to go and start playing Arms or Fury Warrior if I'm playing melee, or maybe Shadow Priest and Affliction Warlock if I'm playing ranged. Maybe you want the opposite. And you can find this type of information, these type of data entries, by looking at simulations. So that is what we had to look at for today. With this out of the way, I'm afraid I have to leave you to the rest of your gloomy, depressing Monday. With this out of the way, we are now leaving each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, as we start our goodbyes, to my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of this channel. Contribution and help which can come, of course, in other ways, like the free ones, liking and commenting down below, or subscribing to the channel itself, as well as other ways, like following me on Twitter or following me over at my stream over at Twitch. These are still fine enough ways to show your support, despite being completely free. With this out of the way, thank you guys, of course, for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime... shit! I was supposed to take a nap, but I ended up sleeping for 4 hours, so my entire sleep schedule is now screwed.